Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, UK net migration has fallen by nearly half. Could this be a much-needed political win for a beleaguered Keir Starmer? Who knows, as Labour also appear to be lurching to the left in an effort to stem the green tide. On top of that, US military drones and jets are encircling Cuba following Donald Trump's indictment of Raul Castro, and Donald Trump silences a Republican lawmaker who looked a little too closely into the Epstein files. I'm Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG, and tonight for Ladies' Night, I am joined for the first time as my co-host by Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so excited to break down the news with you. We're having a really interesting conversation about birth rates before we went live. Maybe we can find a way to weave it in.
I wonder whether that might come up in tonight's show indeed. Of course, we are currently running a fundraiser at the moment. We've asked for 2,000 new supporters. We've blown through that target already, coming up towards 3,000, hopefully, by the end of the week. Ash, why should people at home support a new media for a different politics?
I was in Bangkok recently and I met someone who was watching Novara Media because of our coverage of Gaza. And that was one of those moments where I go, wow, I don't have an idea of how big our reach is when I'm doing this show or when I'm writing the Cortado. And I think that she was surprised to learn just how little, we are doing this on a shoestring, right? Like we have a tiny fraction of our viewers who are paying supporters. And that's great. We don't want paywalls, right? We don't want to have horrendously intrusive ads. We certainly don't want billionaire backers. But for this to continue, for us to be able to grow and for us to be able to tell the stories that really matter to people, not just in the UK, not just in the Anglosphere, but worldwide, we need people to dip into their pockets, right? It's those small, regular donations which keep us resilient and keep us independent.
If you ever needed any more of an incentive with which to sign up, the Office for National Statistics has dropped the UK's latest migration figures, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer is likely to spy a political glimmer of hope in the new stats. That's because in the year to December 2025, net migration fell by nearly half, dropping from 331,000 at the end of 2024 to 171,000 by the end of last year. It also marks a radical drop from the peak of net migration seen in 2024, when little short of 1 million people were added to the UK's population. So what has accounted for the drop this year? It's largely been driven by a significant drop in non-EU nationals immigrating into the UK, with that figure having dropped from around 800,000 at the end of 2024 to a little over 600,000 last year. Meanwhile, emigration out of the UK by non-EU nationals has remained stable since last year, with a little under 300,000 people leaving the country. Emigration of British nationals has remained pretty stable too, while fewer EU nationals are leaving the country. Now, Labour will see this as a political win, with Starmer positively vibing this morning.
Good morning.
Very pleased to see the migration figures this morning come down significantly. And that's obviously on the top of the news about waiting lists last week, where we had a record drop in waiting lists. And of course, the news about growth, the money we've got in our economy, the fastest growing economy in the G7. So that's all really good news within about a week or so. And of course, today we're announcing cost of living package for the summer for families. So I'm really proud that we're getting on and delivering.
Unfortunately for Starmer, it's not clear that the fall in these figures is really due to Labour at all. Policy changes under the former Tory government, including restrictions on overseas students and care workers, bringing family members and dependents with them, are likely to have made the biggest impacts. They also increased the salary threshold for a skilled worker visa from £26,000 to almost £39,000. For their part, Labour ministers have bumped that salary threshold to £41,000, and they've announced further policy proposals, including requiring all migrants to be able to speak English to an A-level standard. Where Labour has had less success is on an issue with a very incredibly high salience to reform voters, which is, of course, asylum seekers. In the year to March, 93,000 people claimed asylum in the UK. That's around 10% down on the previous year, but still more than double the number claiming asylum in the years before the UK formally withdrew from the EU in 2020. Ash, of course, any good news for this government is welcome for them in terms of appealing to the demographics that clearly they are desperate to appeal to, people they're losing votes to. Do you think this will be enough to stem the tide of people walking away from Labour, or do you think there's something more there?
Well, I think that we can go back and look at the new Labour era and look at the way in which the asylum issue became a real stick to beat them with to sort of see whether or not changes in immigration figures tend to benefit Labour governments or not. So in the early 2000s, Britpop is just on its way out, but we're not quite at UK grime. David Blunkett is the Home Secretary. And you have this asylum panic. And there had been an increase in people claiming asylum in this country. But it was a moral panic which was being driven not simply by numbers, but because the Sun and the News of the World made it their cause celeb, right? So it was something which was really being driven by the media. And what you ended up seeing is that you had Labour governments promising crackdowns because they wanted favourable coverage from the Murdoch-owned press. And instead of neutralising the asylum issue, what you found was that the BNP made gains in local elections. Right? They had something of a breakthrough because they were knocking on doors with the mainstream issue of the day. And so one of the key learnings from that is that the salience of immigration as an issue and the importance of it in terms of whether or not it's going to drive people to vote for right-wing and far-right parties, yes, it has a relationship to the numbers of immigrants coming in, whether via the asylum route or by other routes, but more closely it tracks media coverage. So it's difficult for me to see a world in which this, pretty significant decline over 12 months is going to see a commensurate reduction in media coverage of immigration, which is almost always framed in a negative way. It was quite clear for, the past 12 months that immigration numbers were coming down, but the salience of immigration as an issue just kept going up. And that's because you have a whole media ecosystem, which is hyperfixated on the small boats issue, hyperfixated on asylum seekers, asylum hotels. And you also have this feedback loop that exists between the British press and Nigel Farage, a very skilled manipulator and operator within the media environment. So yes, this is a political win if you go, okay, what matters is delivery. But I don't necessarily think that delivery sort of absent from a consideration of that wider context actually matters very much.
I think another issue that they're going to come into with this is that no one's priced in what this is going to do to the economy. And there's multiple different problems that they're creating. Obviously, there's an aging population, a ticking time bomb that's coming in terms of not just state pension provision, but also private pension provision from an aging population. I don't think many people realize this. We talk about the state pension very, very frequently, and people forget that private pensions run on having people paying in to maintain the value of their stock portfolio that can then be drawn out by pensioners claiming right now. A huge glut of boomers retiring and then suddenly drawing into those pension pots with a dearth of people paying into those same private pension pots reduces the overall value of the holdings of those pension funds. And eventually, if they don't have enough people paying in and they have this huge number of people paying out, that will lead those private pension funds to collapse as well. So the aging population problem, which again, birth rates are not going up there, is going to be a massive problem in terms of being able to continually fund welfare state or the state pension, but also broadly to be able to have a functioning economy whatsoever. And if we do end up going, the numbers continue into net emigration, whilst we maintain this very large amount of retirees in this country, that's going to have huge economic problems. Every single government has come in saying, we're going to reduce immigration. And I don't have firm facts on this, but I'm pretty much of the opinion that what's happened with, with George Osborne, whether it's Philip Hammond, whether it is Rishi Sunak, and all of these Tory governments who've promised to come in and cut migration, they've spoken to the OBR on budget day and go, what's the projections if we engage in our policy on migration to cut it to a certain number? And the OBR has gone back to them and said, you will be in recession. You will be in permanent recession because your productive capacity is shrinking and your dependent population of retirees is growing. And so they have had to renege on that because they know that growth or lack of thereof is a bigger killer than negative migration figures. And this government said they wanted to get growth.
And the thing is that has huge political consequences as well. So it tends to be on Novara, we talk about political betrayal as something that happens when politicians promise left-wing outcomes and then they don't deliver them. But there is also a political betrayal which has happened to the right. So in 2016, the main reason people are voting for Brexit is to bring down immigration numbers. Now, the Brexit campaign is talking out of two sides of their mouth at once. On the one hand, it's bring down immigration numbers, we're at breaking point, blah, 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 blah. The other is global Britain. Right? Why should there be preferential treatment for migrants coming from Spain or Italy or Poland or Bulgaria? Whereas, we've got these connections to the Caribbean, we've got these connections to India, we've got these connections, to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So quite quickly, and I think that this is noticeable when you go around the country, is that the composition of the migrant workforce has changed pretty rapidly. So you've seen a reduction in EU migrants, you've seen a much higher number of Indian migrants. If you are someone who voted Brexit because you wanted to bring down immigration, not only do you not see immigration fall, you see it increase, and you see it increase amongst people who are racially and ethnically distinct from the ones who were there before. You're like, what the fuck is going on? And a big part of that is what Brexit actually meant and what happens when you shift where you're getting your immigrants from, away from Europe, more towards the global south. And then there is the second point, which you made, which is that the only thing keeping us out of a recession during those last years of the Tory government was immigration. So there wasn't a growth model. You were just chucking an increased population at the GDP numbers, and you go, look, GDP growth is, above 0. whatever percent. And so again, you've got a Tory party speaking out of two sides of, the mouth at once. You've got Stop the Boats. You've got the historic pledge made by David Cameron to bring down immigration to the tens of thousands. And you've got, essentially an approach that's being led by the Treasury and being led by the fact that they don't have another economic model and saying we're going to rely on population increases anyway. And I think that you've come to something which is important, is that there is a fundamental dishonesty with that way of doing politics, something which drives the far right, but there is something which is at its core really difficult and challenging for this country, which immigration alone doesn't solve. So yes, having working age people who come to this country and who also haven't relied on this country for their education and for their training is a net benefit to the Treasury, right? And that's a way in which you can keep paying into the pension pot and then, it's taken out by our aging population. It's also the case that those workers are going to get older as well. And so this fundamental thing of having an aging population and declining birth rates, where I think that this is a sort of multifaceted problem. It's to do with the affordability of raising children, the affordability of childcare, sure, but I think it's also the fact that in every society on the planet where there are higher birth rates, it's because women have few options. No one has really cracked the nut of how do you balance female autonomy with demographic decline, right, of birth rates. No one's really figured that out. And it is for governments of both the left and the right to get their heads around it. Nobody has yet. Nobody has.
No, I think that's very, very true. Very, very true. One more comment on the economics of this cut in migration that we're seeing is that one of the biggest groups we've seen a drop in numbers of as well, outside of what we discussed there already, is foreign students coming to the UK. We've already seen universities slashing whole departments, not just some jobs, whole departments, whole courses. They're all going, right? I've seen lots of people say, oh, they're just trying to sell visas. And at the end of the day, I'm like, if people want to come here and bring foreign capital in this country to buy our products, when we are a net importer, right? Our balance of payments not in good shape right now. And we have the previous government with their reforms and this current government extending those reforms on access to foreign students coming here to be able to get degrees and to study is going to make that balance of payments crisis even worse, worse. And then we've got a coming inflationary shock. We've got coming shocks in terms of being able to have to import more expensive goods, having fewer exports, which our education sector is hurting jobs in this country, and it's going to make the economic crisis that comes when this whole inflationary Hormuz time bomb kicks off 10 times worse.
And since 2010, universities have basically done everything that's been asked of them, right? Because as well as the trebling of tuition fees, which is the bit that everyone remembers, the bit that everyone forgets, is that came along with a massive gutting of government funding. Right, central government funding. So that means that they have to embrace a more marketized model. It means they want to attract more international students because they come with a lot more money. So that's what they did. Now you had overcrowded classrooms. You also had like a lowering of educational standards because they would go for any international student, lowered course requirements in terms of attendance, stuff like that, because they were like, we want every single moneyed international student that the world can chuck at us. And universities did all that. And so now that you're seeing a decline in international student numbers, you're not seeing a commensurate increase in central government funding. The crisis that UK universities find themselves in, where they're having to shutter whole departments, that is going to get worse.
100%. A gloomy-looking future for the UK economy should trends continue, apparently. US President Donald Trump has had his eye on Cuba since US forces kidnapped Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife in January. Since then, the US government has imposed a harsh oil blockade on the island and its 11 million inhabitants, causing regular blackouts, transport failures, and a crisis in its health service, which has resulted in doctors having to ventilate babies by hand at times. Many in Cuba see the blockade as economic warfare and an attempt by the United States to create the conditions for a coup. That pressure is working, with many Cubans exhausted, impoverished, and hopeless after almost 5 months with almost zero oil entering the country. A single delivery of crude from Russia ran out late last month. Trump also regularly threatened more conventional warfare against the country, saying that he could do anything he wanted to with Cuba. But distracted by their illegal war on Iran, the US didn't launch the military intervention that many Cubans feared. That, however, now appears to be changing, perhaps not least of all because the United States has singularly failed to achieve any of its military goals in Iran, including regime change. Trump needs a win, and potentially putting Cuba in imminent danger, and with the administration now appearing to be rapidly building the case for war. On Sunday, Axios reported that Cuba had stockpiled more than 300 military drones, alleged to have been bought from Iran and Russia. According to the report, the Cuban government has discussed plans to attack the US base at Guantanamo Bay, as well as US ships and possibly even Key West in Florida. Key West is a US city built on an island at the southernmost point of the Florida Peninsula, just 90 miles north of Havana. Now, that Axios report of an imminent Cuban military threat to the United States territory was based on classified intelligence shared with the outlet, so information that the government wanted out there as it possibly begins building an appetite for war. In response to the claims, the Cuban government said this: "Like any country, Cuba has the right to defend itself against external aggression. It is called self-defense and is protected by international law and the UN Charter. Those from the United States who seek the submission and, in fact, the destruction of the Cuban nation through military aggression and war do not waste a single moment fabricating pretexts, creating and spreading falsehoods, and distorting as extraordinary the logical preparation required to face a potential aggression." So, no denial there that they have the drones, but the assertion of the right of the country to defend itself. Since then, tensions have escalated further. On Wednesday, the BBC reported on an increase in the number of military jets and drones being tracked near Cuba last week. It reported at least 5 US Navy Poseidon surveillance aircraft and 3 Triton surveillance operating near Cuba, with some flying as close as 50 miles from the island. Now, those aircraft were trackable publicly, with their transponders set to on, meaning the military want Cubans to know that they're nearby. Of course, that some aircraft are trackable also likely means that more are not. And in the clearest signal yet that the US may launch an attack soon, the government has now indicted the country's former president on criminal charges. 94-year-old Raul Castro led Cuba from 2006 to 2018, taking over from his brother Fidel Castro. Before that, he was defense minister, holding that office from 1959, the year of Cuba's socialist revolution led by Fidel, until 2008. And it was in that role that the United States now alleges that Raul Castro murdered 4 US nationals in 1996 when the Cuban military shot down 2 flights that had entered Cuban airspace. In February 1996, 3 unarmed Cessna aircraft took off from a Florida runway headed for Havana. From the anti-government organization Brothers to the Rescue, the planes entered Cuban airspace despite a warning from Havana. When they continued, Cuban fighter jets were scrambled and 2 of the planes were shot down, with all 4 on board killed. International condemnation followed, with the Cuban government criticized for using military equipment to target unarmed civilian planes. Castro has also been charged with the conspiracy to kill US nationals and destruction of aircraft. Raul Castro has always denied ordering the planes shot down, but the Americans say he oversaw the chain of command that led to the downing of those planes 30 years ago. Now, we've been here before. In 2020, the first Trump administration leveled drug trafficking charges against former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, accusing him of participating in a narco-terrorism conspiracy. It may have taken him 6 years, but Trump eventually got him on the basis of those charges. It was those charges that formed the pretext for a series of pre-dawn strikes across the Venezuelan capital Caracas at the beginning of the year, with the low-flying US aircraft swept over the city and leaving a trail of explosion and fires in their wake. At the same time, helicopters loaded with US Special Forces descended near the presidential residence, where Maduro and his wife were rendered to the US to stand trial. There are fears that a similar tactic will now be deployed in Cuba, with the country's president Miguel Diaz-Canel posting this: "This is a political maneuver, devoid of any legal foundation, aimed solely at padding the fabricated dossier they use to justify the folly of a military aggression against Cuba. The US lies and distorts the events surrounding the downing of the planes belonging to the narco-terrorist organization Brothers to the Rescue in 1996. It knows full well, given the abundance of documentary evidence, that no imprudent action was taken nor was international law violated, as US military forces have indeed been doing that with their coldly calculated and openly publicized extrajudicial executions against civilian vessels in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The charges against Castro were announced by US Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche in Florida on Wednesday, where the announcement was greeted by rounds of loud applause from a large Cuban-American crowd. Blanche was asked whether it was all for show.
This is an indictment because we expect that there was a warrant issued for his arrest. So we expect that he will show up here by his own will or by another way.
There are indications that lend growing credence to the idea that the US may take action soon. And there's another sign that we can add to the list. Perhaps the surest of them all. The New York Times is now manufacturing consent for an intervention, with a lengthy report on a small number of Cubans who appear to support an intervention. If they are going to go in, they should come in, one Cuban told the New York Times, and if not, they should stop talking so much. And at the end of the day, one thing that is really good at boosting people's approval rating is winning wars. And of course, with an impoverished nation like Cuba that's been under blockade, it's sure that the might of the US military stands a good case at winning, which would take the edge off of the fact that he has been so thoroughly humiliated in the war in Iran with Israel. And so I think that, unfortunately, in my mind, such an invasion is probably quite likely. Now, if there's one word beginning with A that comes to mind when you hear the name Wes Streeting, it's aspiration. And he's made his aspirations clear this week, having resigned from his role as Health Secretary after calling for Keir Starmer to resign as Prime Minister to call for a leadership election in which he intended to take part in. His preliminary pitch to the public was aimed squarely at the centrist demographic, with a focus on his desire to rejoin the European Union. But today, he changed tack.
Former Health Secretary Wes Streeting has said he'd like to see a wealth tax. That's a tax on the money people make from investments in the UK. He would propose a wealth tax that works, equalising the rates of capital gains and income tax.
The approach that I'm setting out and the kite that I'm flying in this leadership contest will be to equalise those rates with allowances for genuine entrepreneurialism, investment, reinvestment, so that we can be both pro-worker, pro-entrepreneurialism, pro-fairness, and in the course of that, generate up to £12 billion worth of revenues.
That's a clear pitch towards not only Labour members, amongst whom Streeting currently trails against literally every single other potential leadership rival, but also towards Green defectors, as it's a supposedly fixed version of a policy already championed by the Green Party, who've been advocating for an equalisation of capital gains tax with income tax since before the last general election. It is worth noting, however, that an increase in capital gains tax is not a wealth tax, as much as Wes is calling it that given the salience of the policy championed by the progressive left, with accountant Adam Jaffiers telling the BBC this. This is not a wealth tax. It is an increase in the capital gains tax rate on non-business assets. It is also not a new idea. A wealth tax is an annual levy that targets high net worth individuals based upon their total asset holdings. Capital gains tax is imposed on the increase in value of an asset after it is sold. These are not the same thing. Despite the fact it isn't a wealth tax, multiple outlets have been reporting it as such, so I guess Wesley got the headlines that he wanted with this proposal. His policy has also been backed by tax lawyer Dan Needle, who described it as, quote, a good proposal on Twitter, although he did say that he cringed at Streeting referring to it as a wealth tax that works, quote unquote. Now, what's frustrating to me, of course, there are all the outlets describing this as a wealth tax, because clearly most of these outlets would much rather that potential people who would like an actual wealth tax, who are currently supporting the Green Party or other parties calling for such a policy, I believe Plaid Cymru and the Scottish Greens also won wealth taxes as well, are going to be hoodwinked potentially into thinking that Wes Streeting is actually proposing this when he is not. It's also funny to me, like, does anyone really seriously believe that somebody who was a very high-profile member of Labour together, who were poo-pooing the idea of wealth taxes all the way through the period in which the Labour right were in their ascendancy during Starmer's leadership of the Labour Party, has suddenly received some kind of Damascene conversion on this, you know? It's almost like the leadership election where Keir Starmer promised to make the 2017 Labour manifesto a foundational document. Imagine if you've heard such promises before from somebody trying to win over an electorate that's, got different priorities from the broader electorate. Ash, do you believe Wes Streeting when he is making this coded reference to left-wing policy or not?
I'm going to quote one of the great statesmen of our time, which is George W. Bush, who said, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, you won't get fooled again. And I mean, look, what I think you've described is that the Labour Party is in a moment of being membership facing. So where Streeting is having to make a pitch to the membership, which has a set of politics, which is quite far to the left of his faction of the Labour Party. And he is simply rerunning the Morgan McSweeney playbook, which is you understand that someone who is honest about being on the Labour right will never make it past the membership. So what you do is you single leftwards. So Keir Starmer did that with 10 pledges, which I think, he had no intention of ever keeping. Sebastian Payne said that a senior advisor who remained nameless, but I can only imagine his name possibly rhymed with Schmorgan Schmickschmeeny, said, look at those 10 pledges, not one will tie our hands. And I think that you can see Wes Streeting through exactly the same lens. So he's making noises about a wealth tax. He's, doing it out on a media round because that's what the membership wants to hear. But this is a membership which will have been fairly scarred by the recent experience with Keir Starmer. I don't necessarily think it will work. Maybe it's trying to create a sense of permission to give him a senior, potentially even Big Four cabinet post under Andy Burnham. But thinking about where you're facing, which part of the electorate you're looking at. Streeting is looking right at the selectorate of the Labour Party membership. Andy Burnham is looking at Makerfield. So neither one of these moments, and this will often be understood in this way because we have a media which lacks political literacy, is that...
We'll hear it in our media, though.
Not us, but they'll say, country facing. This is why Burnham is endorsing Shabana Mahmood's immigration plans. Country facing, now, unshackled from cabinet collective responsibility, where Streeting can say the things that he really wants to say. No, politicians are simple Pavlovian creatures. They respond to incentives, and the incentive is the bit of the electorate they're relying on at any given time.
100%. And also worth pointing out, right, Wes Streeting is no stranger to deceptive leadership contests. Because first of all, he called Keir Starmer out for a deceptive leadership contest when he resigned the other week, right? He called out, things were slightly dishonest during the leadership election. But this is the same Wes Streeting, right? I remember this because I was watching this on stream where he was on Political Currency, which is Ed Balls and George Osborne's podcast. I believe it was Political Currency. And he essentially said, well, I was so relieved when Keir Starmer won the leadership contest because it meant we were going to be bringing the Labour Party back towards the centre. I was like, well, hang on a minute. It can't both be deceptive and you be condemning that potentially if you already knew that it was being deceptive because you were secretly hoping the guy who was really pro-Corbyn during the leadership election might win unless you were in on the game to begin with,
It was a bag of dirty lies and I loved every one of them.
So true. So true. And again, the polling of the membership is something Morgan McSweeney did religiously and very, very methodically all the way through 2017 when he approached Keir Starmer to be a potential new leadership candidate and 2019.
And I think this is the thing about the Labour right, which is if there's one thing that they understand probably better than anyone, it is the Labour Party. They understand the mechanisms of the Labour Party. They understand the politics of the Labour Party. And I think they probably understand it a lot better than the Labour left does. And so when you have these deceptive campaigns being designed, it is on the basis of really robust polling, an understanding of how each piece connects with the other. So you're not just thinking about what's it going to be like when you have Keir Starmer installed as Labour leader? The composition of the National Executive Committee is as important, if not more important, because that's what's going to secure your candidate selections. And just to go back to Dan Needle, tax expert Dan Needle, he is part of Labour First. He was the Labour First candidate for the NEC. He donated to Luke Akehurst's election campaign in 2024. And I'm not doubting his expertise in the realm of tax, though actually I think that some of the admitted ignorance on his part of the specificities regarding council tax and canal boats, which are being used for residential purposes, points to there are gaps in some of his expertise. But he is a political operator, and he is a political operator who is using the clothing of, well, I'm an impartial expert on matters of tax for political purposes. Now, I've got no problem with being political operate, with people being political operators outside of just, I am an elected, candidate or whatever, right? I'm totally fine with that, but there has to be a degree of honesty about it. You're a political operator, Dan Needle, and that's why you're like, oh, I didn't like wealth tax, but like West Streeting's coming out with something really good. I think if Andy Burnham came out with it, or God forbid, Zach Polanski, you'd be spitting feathers, mate.
So true. So true. Now, not to be outdone by his potential rival, Keir Starmer's government have joined the policy arms race today by announcing a swathe of cost of living measures they're describing as the Great British Summer of Savings. The Prime Minister summarised the key proposals on his Substack, which apparently he has. We have a new package of support over the summer holidays to give parents a bit of breathing room. From the 25th of June to the 1st of September 2026, we are reducing VAT to 5% on a wide range of family experiences, from children's meals out, cinema tickets, and theatre shows to museums, zoos, fairs, and other attractions. That reduction will apply across the peak summer period, helping to bring prices down when families are most likely to need it. And from the 1st of August, every child aged 5 to 15 in England will be able to travel on buses for free for the entire month. For many families, that will make a real difference. Outside of targeted relief for families, he then went on to announce that the planned rise in fuel duty was to be scrapped too. We are extending the 5p cut to fuel duty for the rest of the year. That keeps fuel duty at its lowest rate in more than 16 years and will save the average driver around £120 by the end of the year. I do love how in this country, motorists just continue to get pandered to by literally every single government. When it comes to council elections, it's all about potholes. When it comes to macro policy, we can increase the bus fare cap to £3, but we'll continue freezing fuel duty for endless year after year after year. And I'm just like, well, we are coming up to a supply shortage on fuel. Putting in demand side incentive for people to be able to purchase more of it doesn't sound like a good idea to me. And it is worth pointing out, I hate to invoke Dan Needle again for the second time in this segment, when it comes to reducing VAT on products, when we look at how that has affected things like menstrual products, for example, it didn't actually reduce the prices when you cut the VAT, right? The actual market price is the intersection of the supply-demand curve. I mean, the price has already been set by the free market in those cases. And so rather than reducing the price in line with a VAT cut with those products where it was tried on, they just increased the margin because people were already willing to buy those products at the original price. So whether or not that cut down to 5% will reduce prices for those attractions remains to be seen. Now, this comes after a week of good news on the economy for the embattled Prime Minister. Growth was higher than expected in Q1, and the IMF upgraded the UK's growth forecast for 2026 to 1%. This is on top of an unexpected drop in the headline rate of inflation to 2.8%, the lowest rate in over a year too, which must be agonising for a government that has squandered a favourable business cycle with unforced errors, only to have their modest economic gains set to be wiped out by the oncoming wave of inflation following the US-Israeli war on Iran. Another high-profile Labour figure appears to be tacking leftwards too. London Mayor Sadiq Khan has blocked a proposed £50 million deal between the Metropolitan Police and AI company Palantir after severe backlash against the Westminster government's insistence on partnering with the Trump-linked company on defence and healthcare contracts. One person who hasn't been reaching out leftwards is Andy Burnham. There were a lot of ruminations on what his policy prospectus might be as a potential leadership candidate, and in the last few days, he said that he won't touch electoral reform until the next election on the grounds that it's a constitutional change, so it would require a mandate from the electorate. He's also committed to adhering to Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules and has backed Shabana Mahmood's immigration reforms. Now, just on the Andy Burnham point, Ash, I'm going to say that when it comes to the proportional representation thing, whilst I understand his point on needing a mandate from the electorate, we're in Trump world now. Electorates are demanding action. I don't think people are necessarily fussed about constitutional process and things like that. People want to see action. People want to see things that are important to them being done quickly and without delay. So I don't really buy his argument that it's necessary to go to the election. But in terms of broadly the conversation here, who do you think here is going to be winning the votes of the left potentially?
Well, I was just to go back to Andy Burnham. There's a couple of ways to look at this. One is you look at Andy Burnham as a Keir Starmer rerun. So he makes left-wing noises. He's got no intention of carrying it out. He's going to run, a sort of standard Labour centrist project. I don't necessarily think that that's true. And the reason why is because while I don't think he's been a left-wing or a socialist mayor of Manchester, he's got a distinctive project, right? Which is he wants to in-house as much as he can, but the sort of compromise that he's making with capital is like real estate gets a free run and gentrification continues apace, all right? That's that's Manchesterism sort of in a nutshell. And I think that when he has said, look, like the reason why there is so much political volatility is because you've got this 5-party reality underneath the first past the post system, and you've got too much of being disciplined by the bond markets. I think he meant that shit, right? I think he meant it. So the way in which I see it is that I wonder if he's sequencing it as you win in Makerfield, you win the Labour Party leadership, and then you go for a general election, say this autumn. Because you go, the things I want to do, you need a mandate from the public. The public gave a strong mandate to the manifesto commitments of this Labour Party, the fiscal rules contained within, not going to touch the electoral system, et cetera, et cetera. I need a new one. And the reason why you would do that, not just because, I really want proportional representation, but for sort of more calculated reasons as well, is because I think he can see the writing on the wall, all right? Your favourabilities are only going to go down. Right? The longer you're in, the better it is for reform. So come in on a bounce, galvanise a stop reform vote behind you, try and block them out for at least the next bit of the electoral cycle. You might be thinking that's the best he can do.
I mean, I can understand that rationale there, especially given the fact that all of the things that caused the Conservative Party to implode, that's happening again imminently. We're going to see another oil shock, another set of cost-push inflation where the country will get poorer. I know we've had a lot of discussion about price controls. We've had discussions about how the government can subsidise different things, right? When it comes to what's happening with a supply chain shock, which will affect our economy because we've not prepared for it, the UK will get poorer. That's just a reality. That's what happened when oil prices go up. The question, of course, is who becomes poorer? Whose back do we place that on? And that's the answer that I want to hear from politicians on broadly those appealing to the left, is how do we look at these coming price shocks and say, look, well, if we're going to see a reduction in the overall supply of goods in the economy, because that's what's going to be the biggest impact on energy for these higher energy prices, then there's somebody's going to have to lose out. And the question, of course, is that in the 1970s, that led to a wage price spiral because no one was willing to give in. What model are we going to look towards from some future left-wing party, whether it's the Green Party or a renewed Labour Party under some kind of new leadership that might move to the left, is what's their plan? Because it's coming real soon.
And look, you can also see why, from Burnham's point of view, he's like, I don't want to tell you my plan now. I need to win in Makerfield. I'm not going to be fucking torn apart by the right-wing media about how I want to nationalise your garden or whatever it was, the kinds of attacks that Jeremy Corbyn came under. I'm not doing that now. I have to win this by-election. So you can see the case from a political calculation perspective of why you would not say everything you're going to do at once. And I kind of think that... Okay, I'm not sure if I think this, but you know what? I'm going to try the idea. I've been entertaining the idea that actually the thing that you want to do to win general elections is you have a big vibes-based campaign, you have policy work going on in the background, and you have a super slim manifesto. So one of the mistakes that I think I was a part of making in 2019 with the Corbyn project is that I thought, the way in which you get a guaranteed socialist government and a socialist program is you stuff the manifesto with all the radical shit you want to see. And so that became the thing that the left was really concerned with doing. Now, probably should have been more concerned with going, how do you shore up a vote, which has, been crumbling and, saw signs of disintegrating in 2017. But that was the thinking. Boris Johnson writes, get Brexit done on the back of a fag packet, right? He, wins a stonking majority. So I think that there is a sort of case for manifesto minimalism to get you past a general election. But it entirely depends on whether or not you would trust Andy Burnham on a project of manifesto minimalism. Is another thing entirely, right? Which Andy Burnham are we getting? There's the joke of a Corbynista, a Brownite and a Blairite walk into a bar, bartender says, and what will it be tonight, Mr. Burnham? Which Andy Burnham are you going to get? How is he going to react to the disciplining tools both within the Labour Party and also externally, particularly thinking about the bond markets? And who is it that he's looking to for policy drafts at the moment? We don't know any of those things. So I would say if you had, a sort of Zoran Mamdani type candidate, someone who has a long and deep history of being on the left, I would say don't try and get him to verbally commit to all the shit that you want. That's a bad idea, right? Like manifesto minimalism. Very different kind of candidate with Andy Burnham.
I think the only issue with that strategy is that this is basically the Starmer project. In fact, I have referenced many times, because you directly called this stuff out to Darren Jones's face on Politics Live. We said, well, this manifesto here, all that's there to do is to get you over the line. And there's going to be a bunch of stuff where you do reforms to certain kinds of taxation after the election. And that was literally what happened. Like, I remember Darren Jones shaking his head at you going, no, us have a light manifesto, then just go, oh, shock horror, things are worse than we feared. Do these things with no necessarily mandate from the public. And what was the electorate's reaction to this? They bounced off it immediately. It was like, you're doing this, and this. It wasn't in the manifesto. You've lied to us as a public. And there was immediately a 3 million signature petition for a general election because the public felt betrayed by a manifesto that didn't contain the things that they actually did.
You certainly don't say something like no tax rises and then you go, okay, no, but it's just going to be on, employers' national, national insurance contributions. You don't do it like that. What I mean by vibes is like, get Brexit done was sort of a floating signifier.
True.
What does it mean to get Brexit done? It was appealing to this idea of we all just want this fucking over, right? Like you do this sort of like big vibe, right? Like something which speaks to the moment. It's really slim in the manifesto. The thing is that the approach of Keir Starmer, and I suppose this is where I differ with you, is that there were quite specific promises that he thought he could get out of on a technicality. And
the wording that they used specifically was, there are no things in our manifesto that require tax rises. Yeah. That was the specific wording. I remember West Streeton came out with it so often when they were pressed heavily on this kind of stuff, on loads of discussion shows. Like, there are no tax rises that are necessary to be able to deliver the things in our manifesto. And then it was like, oh, black hole. And
then they'll go, oh, but we never actually promised that, because if you look at the wording, and no one likes that, right? No one likes someone getting off on a technicality. So I think that is actually really different from the kind of manifesto minimalism of Boris Johnson.
I think that's probably true. It's been 6 months since the Epstein Files Transparency Act was passed into law in the United States, introduced to Congress by Democrat Ro Khanna. But there's another lawmaker who can take credit for reaching the House floor. Thomas Massie is the sitting representative for Kentucky's 4th Congressional District, and thanks to him filing a discharge petition, he forced the bill to be voted on by Congress. What makes this unusual is the fact that Massie is a Republican, the party of Donald Trump, and the US president has had his presidency derailed by the revelations found in the unredacted Epstein documents. Massie was not shy of criticism for how the Trump administration has handled the release of those documents either, even going as far as accusing Trump-appointed former Attorney General Pam Bondi of covering up information in breach of the Transparency Act in this interview with the BBC.
But at some point, somebody got to Pam Bondi and said, it's your job to cover this up.
Do you genuinely believe that this is the top lawyer for the administration, that she would be... I mean, do you have any evidence that she's blocking stuff?
Oh, absolutely. And she's not just the top lawyer, she's the top law enforcement officer. Mm-hmm. She happens to be a lawyer, but she's the law enforcement officer. And she's not carrying out this law the way that it's intended. I can give you examples. So, for instance, in the hearing, I pointed out that they had redacted Leslie Wexner's name. And she said, well, we're not trying to cover up for Leslie Wexner. He shows up thousands of times in the files that we've released. I said, yes. But in the one instance where your own department, the FBI, thought he was a co-conspirator, that in a child sex trafficking case, that is the instance where it was blocked out. And so my question to her was a serious one, and I still haven't got an answer. Who blocked it out?
It's not the first time Trump and Massie have locked horns either. As a staunch libertarian, he opposed Trump's big beautiful bill on the grounds of it spiraling the US deficit. But perhaps the greatest break with Trump's leadership is with his close relationship with Israel and his support for the country's genocidal war on the Gaza Strip. One of the only Republican lawmakers to vote against such bills as the affirmation of Israel's right to exist, the emergency military aid package to Israel in the wake of Operation Al-Aqsa flood in October 2023, and subsequently he also called for all military aid to Israel to be cancelled, tweeting this: "Nothing can justify the number of civilian casualties, tens of thousands of women and children, inflicted by Israel in Gaza in the last 2 years. We should end all US military aid to Israel now." On top of this, he also angered the pro-Zionist lobby by announcing a bill to force AIPAC to register as a foreign agent just days before the primary election. It's no secret that under the second Trump administration, the Republican base has morphed into a cult of personality around Donald Trump. And during this year's round of congressional primaries, Trump-backed candidates have consistently beaten incumbents across the United States. And with Thomas Massie, the president had some scores to settle. Massie's opponent was a relatively unknown MAGA loyalist named Ed Galrine, a former Navy SEAL and staunch backer of Trump's abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and he was an open critic of Massie's efforts to block Trump's illegal assault on Iran, claiming that Massie had joined with the radical Democrats to restrict the president's responsibilities as the commander-in-chief with what is going on in the Middle East. And that's all that Trump and AIPAC needed to hear, and the super PACs got to work. They turned it into the most expensive primary race in US history, overtaking the pro-Zionist lobby's successful attempt to unseat progressive Jamal Bowman. AIPAC and other pro-Israel donors joined forces with Israeli-American billionaire Miriam Adelson to dump up to $28 million on the race, with Trump's MAGA KY PAC to reach approximately $35 million in total spending. The Trump admin also got involved themselves, sending War Secretary Pete Hegseth to the seat to campaign directly, and Trump himself posted a barrage of messages to his followers about the race on Truth Social, finishing off with this. The worst congressman in long and storied history of the Republican Party is Thomas Massie. He is an obstructionist and a fool. Vote him out of office tomorrow. On Tuesday, it'll be a great day for America. President DJT.
Sorry, I was barely keeping it together.
And vote him out of office they did. Galrine beating Massie by 10 points. Massie pulled no punches when he conceded the race, however, with the crowd cheering his name as he started calling out the Israel lobby directly, with this jibe at his opponent.
Listen, I would have come out sooner, but I had to call my opponent and concede, and it took a while to find Ed Galrine in Tel Aviv.
Later, Massie called out the people he exposed in the Epstein files.
And we need basic decency. We need basic decency. That's what the Epstein Files Transparency Act was all about. By the way, today is the 6-month anniversary of the Epstein Files Transparency Act. We've taken out 24 CEOs, an ambassador, a prince, a prime minister, a minister of culture. And that was just 6 months. I got 7 months left in Congress.
Thomas Massie received support from across the political spectrum after his defeat. Here's former Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, no relation. I am proud and thankful to have served in the US House of Representatives with my friend Thomas Massie, a giant among weak, pathetic men. Releasing the Epstein files was our demise, but it was worth every single bit because now everyone knows the truth. You are ruled by the Epstein class that cares nothing about you and your elected leaders are bought and controlled by a foreign lobby. Tonight, the future of the Republican Party was destroyed. The real America First movement will rise, led by the younger generations who hate the old guard with an unquenchable passion. Let us pray that we have a country left by the time these creatures are gone. And on the other end of the spectrum, here's Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar.
Congresswoman, do you think that Massie was defeated last night because of his support for transparency in the Epstein Files Transparency Act?
Yes, and his anti-war stances, his advocacy in trying to make sure our tax dollars don't continue to fund a genocide in Gaza. Those $30 million did not come from thin air. We know who paid for that money.
Yeah, I mean, he said that, Israel is the only country that is allowed to buy elections here other than our own. So.
Well, certainly in his case, in Cori Bush's case, and in Jamal Bowman's case, that statement seems to be accurate.
And in my personal opinion, the most succinct summary of the day came from political commentator Hassan Piker. Massie's defeat proves that the Republican Party is a pro-Epstein, pro-Israel cult, led by their cult leader, Epstein affiliate, servant of Israel, Donald Trump. Now, I won't comment on the veracity of what he's saying there, but I do think it's interesting that in the wake of tumbling approval ratings for Donald Trump, the MAGA base are insanely loyal to whoever Trump says for them to back, like they're also backing Ken Paxton in the primary in Texas, who is slated to lose to the Democrat James Tallarico there as well. Will he ever lose his grip on the Republican Party, even if they get absolutely obliterated in the midterms?
Well, I actually think that in some ways Donald Trump might be the only man who's been capable of holding the Republican Party together. And the reason why is that they're obviously a deeply establishment party, imbricated in the status quo, and a status quo which has not served Americans for decades. But he has managed to capture and absorb and monopolize that anti-politics feeling. So he has come down on the side of capital again and again. So Trump always chickens out. Taco can often be summarized as he will listen to Wall Street when they're, yelling in his ear loud enough. I think that you can also say that the tendency to follow Netanyahu, I think that there are some personality reasons for it, but it's also, the Raytheons and the Palantirs are more influential than the, real non-interventionists within his party. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't strong America first type figures who could be competitors to whoever Trump's successor might be. So you think about the other MTG, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, when they say America first, they really mean it, right? That there isn't a carve out for Israel. There are other things going on in their politics as well that I think that you can't ignore. The white Christian nationalism that is in there is something which is really important, and you can't just glaze over that because of what it is that they've had to say about the war in Iran or support for Israel, so on and so forth. But on that America first, we're not spending loads and loads of money to prop up other governments. Like, they really mean it. And so you look at somebody like J.D. Vance, who quite clearly wants to be the inheritor of MAGA, right? You wonder if he can do it the way Trump can, right? You wonder if he couldn't have bigger chunks torn out of him by the likes of Tucker Carlson or Marjorie Taylor Greene. So it's not for me a case of, can Trump keep a grip on the Republican Party? The answer is yes. It's, could anybody else?
That's a really important point. I think on the other side of this issue, the three most expensive primaries in US history have all happened in the last 4 years. They've all happened in the last 4 years. And it was Cory Bush, it was Jamal Bowman, as mentioned before, and then, of course, now is Thomas Massie. And all three of those were the biggest spending in terms of primary races because of AIPAC, because of the pro-Zionist, pro-Israel lobby. And whilst on the Democratic side, it seems that eschewing AIPAC has in some ways ingratiated members of Congress with their electorate. We see Chris Rabb, who also won in that same primary evening in Pennsylvania, that specifically was asked when he was asked to comment about the pro-Israel lobby, he said, fuck AIPAC. That was his explicit response. Why do you think it's been so different on the Republican side?
Well, I actually want to talk about something, which is the anti-Semitism of the Israel lobby. So I don't know if you saw the comments made by John Podhoretz, who's a neoconservative commentator and a staunch defender of Israel, a staunch Zionist. He was talking about the defeat of Thomas Massie in the primaries and said, well, this is a warning to every other candidate. And I'm quoting him, right? I'm quoting him directly. He declared that Jewish money should be used openly to force politicians through a political buzzsaw. So if anybody else said that, if anybody else said that Jewish money is being used as a political buzzsaw against politicians who are deemed to be threatening towards Israel's interests, you would be called an anti-Semite. But because that is coming from somebody who is a staunch advocate for Israel, he's just stating facts. So there's something about the way in which organizations like AIPAC, despite the fact that it is an American organization, it's shaping American politics, they do not give a fuck about American Jews. Like, they do not care one bit about American Jews. They do not care about the safety of the diaspora. They do not care about anti-Semitic tropes, right? Whereas, if Ilhan Omar said, it's all about the Benjamins, everyone's on her like white and rice. because the real dividing line isn't whether or not you use anti-Semitic tropes, it's whether or not you are hostile to Israel's interests. Like, that is the only thing that matters. And I think that you are going to see more of this as time goes on, more of this selective, I don't know what you'd call it, like sort of selective tolerance for anti-Semitism, right?
I mean, it's the dual loyalty trope, but only in one direction.
Only in one direction.
You are given infinite permission to invoke the dual loyalty trope as long as you are defending Israel and Zionism.
Yeah.
This happens so often. Where I mean, I was actually watching a clip. It was on the Jeremy Vine show or something, where someone was saying, "Oh, you can't go on this anti-Israel stuff because you're making anti-Semitism worse." I'm like, no, you, the person, this conservative who was on this panel, you are making anti-Semitism worse because you are saying implicitly to everybody who's looking at their phones, seeing, genocide in Gaza, saying Jews are indelibly linked to this. You cannot criticize this genocide because you're criticizing Jewish people implicitly. And all that's doing is fueling anti-Semitism.
Every time you use Jewish people in the diaspora as a human shield for Israel, you are increasing anti-Semitism. You are, because one, you are doing the anti-Semitism, right? You are saying the existence of these people in the diaspora is inherently linked to this country that's abroad. Like, congratulations, you've invented anti-Semitism from first principles. There's that. And then the other thing is the creation of resentment. That's the thing. John Podhoretz, I'm assuming that he's Jewish. I'm just making that assumption based on the sort of use of the words we and our when he's saying, we have to use what it means there are at our disposal. Assuming that he is himself Jewish. There is this recklessness, which is what do you think this is going to make people think about Jewish people? If you say, I think we should weaponize our money and we should turn it into a political puzzle. You care more about a state which is not your own, right? It's thousands of miles away, more than you care about your family members, your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, even yourself. It's crazy.
It is absolutely crazy, absolutely crazy. Well, indeed, that's the end of the show tonight. Thank you, Ash, very much for joining me for the first time on Ladies' Night. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The patriarchy has tried to keep us apart for too long. And
it has, so true.
It may continue to succeed, and that's why I'll be on with Michael Walker next week.
And as always, everybody at home, make sure if you want to support our independent journalism, our entirely publicly, as in, I guess, supporter-funded journalism, make sure you go to novara.media/support and make sure we hit our goal of 3,000 additional subscribers by the end of the week. Thank you everyone at home for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.